Okay, we right? Yeah, we're on there. So just to start this, we're starting with a question about frost. And I said it's predominantly, the valerian preparation, but 501 silica and even dandelion help in that process. Now, you could also argue that a bit of chamomile would be a good thing because that will help with the regeneration of the plant after any kind of stress, give that sort of etheric boost. Now, these are trials that took place in 2002, and it's by the New Zealand Hort Research, which is the government research body. So these are official, good trials. And what happened was we made up this product for frost, and we gave it to an apple grower down in the Hawke's Bay region. And he put it on, and they had a 4-degree frost, which is quite strong, and it had quite a devastating effect on the whole area and the apple industry. And his was the only orchard that wasn't any damage at all. And so his neighbour was this research centre. And there was quite a movement towards organic apples at the time, and so that local organic apple group organised with these guys to run that trial. It cost $1,500, which is incredibly cheap, because everybody was interested. And so they redid the frost. They had lots of flowering apples in bags in a research facility, and they redid the frost, the timing for how long it was, because frost isn't just frost, it's about how long for how deep, is the devastation, right? And so they redid that, and so this is at -4, and so it showed effect. Here's the control over here, and so, what do we got here? This is with some seaweed, and this is just what we call Thermomax, just by itself, and then they ran fish oil as a control. And so we can see that the actual Thermomax worked better by itself than with seaweed, whereas we have found that seaweed will give you a couple of degrees of control usually. And so, we have a client who regularly uses seaweed, copper and Thermomax, and he gets to -5-degree frosts all the time. So these things stack. And so the beauty of this biodynamic frost protection is it adds 2 degrees at least to any other frost protection method except urea, because we're stimulating the phosphorus with the valerian preparation, and phosphorus and nitrogen are sitting next to each other in the periodic table, so they push each other out. Just like calcium and magnesium sort of push each other around, so do nitrogen and phosphorus. And so that's the one thing we found. This is high analysis urea that people use. Basically, the same as seaweed and all those sort of mineral additives or substance additives, is what you're trying to do is fill the cells up with something other than water. And if that happens, then they won't freeze. So it's pretty harsh. But the problem is if you go and pile on a lot of urea, of course that causes very soft leaf watery growth. So there's a negative to that. But other than that, everything else, so we put this on with fans, water, they get to -5 degrees, but the plants suffer incredibly, so that they take quite a bit to get over that again. And they're finding if they use Thermomax at the same time, the plants are getting up and going. So even though these people have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on all these other methods, they use this because it works out at, we sell it at $320 a litre, by the way. And so that does 4 hectares per litre. and so that works out at about $80 per application. But it gives you a 3-week protection window, and so, you know, that's pretty good, $80. And we're putting it into kiwi fruit predominantly, which is, you know, $100,000 income per hectare sort of stuff. So this is nothing. It's compared to running a big windmill, all of those other, like helicopters, $12,000 a night, you know. And of course the growers have got to be up managing that, and with water they've got to be up making sure all the sprinklers are working. So our guys don't. They sleep. They know they've got this 3 weeks protection. So the lifestyle benefit is actually quite huge as well. So there's all these interesting little pluses that come with this. So this is showing benefit to -4 degrees. However, you will see leaf burn at -2 degrees. And so that's why we only advertise -2 degrees. But, you know, the stems and the buds will be protected to -4 degrees. So, yeah. And the same shows at a -2 frost, that same sort of pattern is showing. But, you know, the Thermomax stood up well. So this in 2002. And it was quite funny. Caroline and I were travelling through America at the time, and we got a phone call, you know, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and told of this story, and we thought, oh, fantastic, it's all on, you know. But of course, I guess there was no more frost or something, so we had to wait. They did this pretty much straight away, so this would have been October, and they did it pretty much straight away. And then they wouldn't release the findings until February because they wanted to see what negative impact it would have. How's it going to influence the fruit and all that sort of stuff. So we didn't get the document until February. And so through that following winter, I'd already been working with kiwi fruit. So we got all that set up, and we basically gave product away to get people to put it on. And, you know, our frost, the kiwi fruit starts flowering around from the 1st of September. And, you know, we had a really warm September, and it was like, oh God, you know, that's no good. But around the 5th of October, we were out one Saturday night, and I came out of this hall wherever we were at about 10 o'clock, and the skies were just clear as a bell, you know, and you could just feel the crispness in the air, and it was like, okay, here comes the frost. And so the next day, which was a Sunday, we had a 2-degree frost or whatever. And there it was proof that this thing worked. And one of the interesting things that you see is that frost would be on the timber, you know, the uprights, because it's all on pergolas, the kiwi fruit. And so there's frost on the wood, but there's no burning on the plant. So the plants, you know, as I say, the internal temperature raises 2 degrees, and that's what does the frost protection, and so no burning there. So on the Sunday, that day, we sold $36,000 worth of product. You know, it was just, you know, we lived up the hill from the distributors, you know, and so we get a phone call and drop it down, and get another phone call, drop it down, like 4 times at the end of the day. So that was the beginning of that, and we're now 20 years later. And so this product is sort of embedded in the kiwi fruit industry, and of course a lot of the younger generation are coming in, and it's already there. You know, and I've got to say, I've taken a sort of Vegemite attitude. You know, Vegemite hasn't changed since 1954. You know, the label's the same, everything's the same. And that's what I've done. I've just left it all the same because, you know, growers, but kiwis in particular, there's incredible brand loyalty. You know, and if it's just there and it's always there, then people will just keep. And now it's actually grown in the last 3 years. I guess the contractors have got onto it. You know, it's fairy dust to normal growers, and so there was all that scepticism. But now it's just 20 years later and it's done the job and everybody trusts it, and so people use it. They don't care that it's fairy dust.
Glenn, so at $80 a hectare, if you were brought over grain growing or grazing, that's not...
That's right. So this is...
You use it then through your broadcast towers. What's the shelf life on that?
Forever. You know, it's the beauty of homeopathics. They're incredibly sort of stable. They're non-toxic. They're cheap to make. We put them in a plastic bottle so they transport. They can bounce around your car. You know, I take the attitude that it's a farmer's technology. So, you know, the shed where I make this stuff is dirty. You know, because a farmer's shed is dirty. And so part of it that we use alcohol, and that does a few things. It keeps the mixture sterile. So I've got bottles that are 30-year-old that are still clear with no fungus or anything growing in it. Whereas it'll take maybe a month and you'll start getting fungus growing and stuff if you don't have alcohol. And that's everything therefore has alcohol, so you just turn the jug upside down and it's sterile because it's alcoholic. But the rest of this place is actually, you know, there's lots of paper because packing paper, and it's a shed, so it actually absorbs moisture, which is quite good. But if you look at it, it's dirty because that's what's real. There's no good having me in a lab coat in somebody's lab over here doing a technology that you can't do. You know, that's not what we want. It's got to work. And so if you know, homeopathics, they talk about you can't put it near electricity and you've got to keep it in the fridge and you know, all these don'ts. And it's like, well, that's no good. That's not our technology. You know, it's got to work. And so this stuff has to be able to go into a plastic bottle and be shipped. I had real concern for a long time that we were doing business in Chile, and so I actually used to go to Chile to make the stuff because I didn't know what would happen to it on the ship, you know, with all on the way. And once that became quite difficult, we started doing it in New Zealand and shipping it, and it worked perfectly well. You know, so you know, the same, we sell it through normal distributors. And as I say, the farmers, they can put it in their truck, they put it in their tractor, you know, it's robust. And so that's all part of it, really.
So when it's even sprayed out, you know, some would say about putting it under pressure and all that.
Well, that's no good because that's not real, you know. And there was this whole thing about, you know, we can't mix it with poisons and all that sort of carry on. And back in about 91, we did this trial with this guy on grapes, and we were looking at you know, the ripening of the grapes. And at the same time, he had a phylloxera block, you know, sort of 2-3-year-old block of grapes that were being attacked by phylloxera aphids on the roots. And so we did that. We sort of made something up and we did that, and those vines recovered, and we sprayed the 501 a couple of times on a row of grapes, and that row of grapes ripened up 3 weeks earlier than everything else. And then we said to him, oh, you know, we can only work with organic. You're going to have to be organic. And he said, no, we're not going to do that. And we sort of went, well, we can't work with you. But we've proven we could work with them. So that was the biggest shot in the foot that I've ever done, you know. So now, as I say, the only thing that we advise people not to combine with this product is urea. So this goes in with fungicides, bactericides, whatever, systemic insecticides. It goes in with that and it works. So, you know, there's a lot of myth around the preparations.
What alcohol do you use?
Ethyl alcohol. I buy it in 20-litre, you know, drums. 90%. I use distilled water and at 10% alcohol. Now, 10% is what it works out at, and that's okay with the kiwi fruit guys because they're putting it into a 2,000 litre sprayer per hectare, so the amount of alcohol is really reduced. Where we deal with dairy farmers who are using, maybe 100 litres or maybe 200 litres per hectare, we supply that. It basically works out at 1% alcohol. Because alcohol does, any waxy coating on leaves that are using for insect protection and so on, that actually gets dissolved by alcohol. So it is a bit of a question. And because these guys are using such low water rates, and they're going to use it, within the next month, they're going to spray it out anyway. And so when you're potentising something, it's 1 to 10 sort of potency. And so we'll have, let's call it D2 at 10% alcohol. If we just use water in the next potency, then that's 1%. There's only just 1% alcohol. So that's not damaging. So we do that, for dairy farmers. The government made us put organic homeopathic on the label in the front, so we make that big. And so we were forced to tell, so that we weren't, ripping anybody off or deceiving anybody. That's their language. And so, sure, okay. So, yep. We don't shy away from saying it's biodynamic. All we had to put on was organic, and it's organic certified and all those sorts of things. There's, any product, you've got to go through a ACVM sort of government accreditation thing, as well as BioGrow and so on. So.
Do you potentise it and then you add it to the alcohol? You don't.
No, the alcohol goes into the water.
Oh, okay.
So we have a barrel of water that is 10% alcohol and distilled water, and that's what we use then when we're doing the potentising. That's the bulk part of it.
The alcohol level just keeps getting reduced.
Well, no, because we keep using the barrel of 10% alcohol. We've got a 10% alcohol barrel like that, and then we just keep using that water in the potentising process. So it's always 10%, and that holds it. It'll, as I say, it'll keep for many, many years.
Glenn, like you're going to talk about potentising later on.
Yeah.
Do we want to leave some of this discussion for then?
Yep, sure, yep. So I'll just show you a couple of pictures just to, bring it home. So this is actually Tamarillos, and this was at our place, and I sprayed all these guys, and I left that one. And this is my neighbour, literally through this hedge here. This is what happened to his. So.
Where's this?
Bay of Plenty, New Zealand. Yeah. Frost. Yeah. And this was some avocados that were sort of sitting around in a paddock, and so we have sprayed and unsprayed, 3 degrees sort of frost. This was a trial we did looking at this internal temperature issue. And so we sort of have a probe that we put into these avocados. And what it showed is when we sprayed it, we had this is basically 2.5 degree temperature difference. And then over the next fortnight or so, it came back to 1 degree, and we sprayed it again, and the next time we were back up to this 2 degree internal temperature. So it's just showing, that functionality really. And these actually went through a 6 degree frost. So there was -3 degree frosts, and then this 6 degree frost. And so in the 6 degree frost, they did sort of burn in this sort of area, but the rest of it was okay, and he prunes that off anyway. He he left his pruning every year until after the frost, and what he pruned off naturally was the bit that got burnt with this 6-degree frost.
So you wouldn't be able to do the opposite too, like you'd be able to make one heat stress.
Well, I think, I'd be looking in that chamomile yarrow 500 sort of area for that, personally, just to give that sort of resilience. And I guess that's what the drought buster is, you know, the Etheric 7, which is this chamomile 500 product. That's what we use for drought stress. So yeah, that'd be the product. Okay, so and this is the first guy I ever worked with in 1991, and I still work, you know, we still supply him 30 years later or whatever it is. So I was a bit late coming to this story. Being a bit of a self-taught person and not really having much interaction with other people, you know, there's holes. You know, when you're self-taught, there's these bits that you miss, and you sort of, instead of learning it that way, you learn that bit and this bit and that bit, and eventually it sort of comes together. So this is actually, I think, while it's an important story, I think it is quite central. And in Europe, you know, I can now see this is a story people have been talking about in Europe for quite some time. And so what it is Steiner talking about the energetic activities that are taking place through the seasons. And in 1923-24, he told this story about 6 times. So there's 6 different lecture cycles, usually with about 4 lectures in each of the cycles. And each time he sort of took a different angle. And so I'm using 3 particular lectures. And so the agriculture course, you can see predominantly in the second lecture really, that he does sort of talk about this seasonal cycle. And then in 1923, there's a one called Man as Symphony of the Creative Word is a lecture series, which is really quite fascinating to read. And in there, one of those lectures, he's talking about the elemental beings and the ethers and how they sort of work through the season. And a week later, he talks about what I mentioned yesterday, the same story, but in the terminology of wood sap, life sap, and cambium. Same story. And then, you know, let's say a month earlier, there's a cycle called the seasons and the archangels. And so it's all within that sort of Christian archangel sort of story. And then there's another sort of 3 cycles in there. There's one called the cycle of the year, which I think is a little bit more digestible than these other ones. But then there's a couple of cycles that are right off in the Christian anthroposophy. And so this winter time that we're now coming into here, instead of him talking about the way the gnomes are collecting everything together in the soil so that we can have this sort of fructification event that then leads into this upward growth, which is quite an easy language to accept. It's all about, you know, Ahriman is coming out of the earth and grabbing you and dragging you down, and there's this huge sort of spiritual battle taking place, you know. So I've tended to sort of not bother with those ones and just focus on these 3 or 4 that are, you know, a bit more digestible. And so the process was, you know, getting each of those stories and seeing how they sort of match up and then turning them into one story. And so that's the first part of this book, is me doing this process. And then the rest of it is just following that same language through the agriculture course and a couple of other courses. So personally, I think that is a book that most people should read because it sort of gives this seasonal picture. Now, just to run through this story. Now, a practice that I've started doing in the last few years, and various people do it in different ways, is that I have a circle at home in my front yard. It's only a 6-metre circle, and I have a seat. And so I just move the seat around the circle through the seasons, and every few days I'll just sit in the seat for 10 or 15 minutes and just, okay, where are we? Where are we in the cycle? What's happening? How am I seeing that around me in all the trees? And so it just gives this sort of experience of this seasonal cycle. Other people talk about having a certain spot that they just sit in, once a week and look at how the season's changing, through the year, just how things are altering in that immediate environment. So in various ways, this is a practice that a lot of biodynamic people sort of do in various ways. And, I'm finding it useful, interesting to experience. And you might remember yesterday when I said around this time, sort of the sense of being sucked into the earth. That was sort of last week or so. I was sitting there and it was just, it was quite a strong experience, really. So the story is really best started at midwinter, which is where we are right now. And so we'll come back to that because it's the end of the cycle as well as the beginning. So we'll just start from that point that we have all this accumulated activity from last season now ready to come out of the soil. And Steiner makes this comment about this event that it takes place. He says in the Northern Hemisphere that it's mid-January to mid-February. And he talks about this being a point of crystallisation. And so what he's saying is that Lily Kalisko, by the way, did all of these trials that showed what she would do is she'd have these mineral sodium chloride, silver nitrate and gold chloride and these sorts of things. And so she would put something into the gold chloride and then place it and wait for that to crystallise and then sort of read the pattern that's in the crystal. And she'd find this would change according to all sorts of variables. But what she did find is that crystallisation process had a different timing as she went through the year. And they reached this time of the year where it was a sort of maximum crystallisation. And so Steiner, interestingly, Steiner had a lot of really intelligent people around him, and he borrowed their work. And this was one of these things that he sort of got from Lily Kalisko and presented it in the agriculture course. But there's a lot of that once you start looking, that these people did the research and he then spoke it. Now, so he's talking about this sort of time just after midwinter. And Lily Kalisko only did her research in the Northern Hemisphere. But in 1951 in Italy, there's this guy called Picardi is his last name. I can't remember the first name. And he did these same trials, and he did them in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And he found that there was a similar event in just after midwinter in the Southern Hemisphere as the Northern Hemisphere. And what he tracked it to, not that I actually have this, I'd have to look and find the picture, but what he tracked it down to was that, the sun, we sort of look at the sun and we think the sun's stationary, but we also know the sun's not stationary. It's moving at, I think it's moving at, is it moving at 64,000 miles per hour through the galaxy? Right? I think it's the Earth is moving at 46,000 miles per hour around the sun, and we're spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. So in fact, we're moving at something like 115,000 miles per hour at the moment. So it's the Earth spinning, the Earth around the sun, and then the sun around the galaxy, which takes 200 million years to go once around. And so we've got the sun actually moving, in that direction like that. And then we've got the Earth going around the sun, but we're not exactly flat, we're on a bit of an angle. And so what we actually get is that the Earth is doing that, around the sun. So every year you're getting a crossing point here and you're getting a crossing point there. And what this Italian guy showed was that this is what's causing this crystallization event. And so this is happening around about March, actually, and this is happening around about August. So we have these two events that are cosmologically real. It's not, and they've just shown it in this crystallization. And so this is an event that sort of takes place here. And then as we move a bit further, there's this event that occurs in August. Southern hemisphere is the blue, right? So all these blue dates here, that's us. And so around this 5th of August, at our place, this is when we start seeing the major bulb bloom sort of taking place. So there's this first sort of upthrust. And you'll find that, your seasons probably aren't as defined as ours, but, winter is still there and nothing's really growing. And in the beginning of August, you start seeing all this sort of new growth sort of taking place. And so in this Manner's Symphony of Creative Word, Steiner points out that this is this point where it's actually the Earth's etheric body comes above the horizon. And so the concept is that the Earth, like us, like plants, like animals, it also has a physical, etheric, astral and spirit taking place. And what he says is taking place is that, of course, comes up to the southern hemisphere, goes to the northern hemisphere, right? That's what's happening with the sun. That we have summer, they have winter. And so he's saying that these four bodies of the Earth actually come out of above the horizon is the best way of looking at it, So at the moment, the etheric and the astral and the warmth have all gone to the northern hemisphere. So they're dominant, expressive out there. And you might have noticed that just recently there's been this sort of cold snap. We've had a really long, lovely warm spell in New Zealand. And literally, after this end of May sort of date, in comes the cold. Now, so what's taking place is that around the 5th of August, we have the Earth's etheric coming above the horizon. And it goes through a 6-month period, basically, so that by the time we come to February, early February, it's now going below the horizon. And so the image that we've got here is that we've got all these plants here, and now the Earth is sort of giving all this etheric force to the plants. So they've got their internal etheric, but now the world etheric is coming. And it's quite an important point because in February, that world etheric goes back down. So now the plant is left with its own etheric only, right? It's just running on its own fuel. And what I've noticed is there's sort of 3 main times that we get powdery mildew attacks in our environment. And the first is here in August, that there's this sort of potential for powdery mildew showing up. And so Yeah. And the second one, just as we go through, is here in November, around early November. There's an attack there. But the big one for grape growers takes place in February. And so the question is, how is this disease related to these bodies? And we can, say that, okay, we're getting the etheric coming out. And so what is powdery mildew? It's a hot, dry fungal disease. So we need that hot, dry in relationship to some moisture, but hot, dry basically being the implication. And so for me, where we're getting these disease processes taking place at these critical points is, how is the plant's etheric connecting to this world etheric? Because, the hot, dry astral influence, as it were, is always working onto the plant. But if the plant's got a strong enough etheric, it keeps pushing it off so it doesn't get the disease. So, this is this point where the world etheric is coming into play, but the plant's not connecting. It's not making that connection to that world etheric properly, is my interpretation. Okay, so this is the point where there's this first burst of growth in the season. Now, for me, that's when we suggest to our dairy farming clients that they put on 501 at that time, because there's all this soft spring growth that's coming out, and there's a danger with 501 that that downward push is too strong and you start getting burning and plants going off to seed and all that. And there's not much growth anyway prior to that, but just once that spring growth starts going, I like to do a 501 at that time, just to sort of pull it all together. And so off we go, and there's all sorts of, it's, I guess one thing I would like to do is have a notebook, and the wattle is flowering quite early, and just keep a track of who's flowering through this season, because different plants are sort of in their peak flowering and pollination and so on through this cycle. And so when we come to the spring equinox, this is the point where the Earth's astral activity is now coming above the surface. And so in Steiner's story, he's talking about this wood sap. And when I mentioned yesterday how he said this wood sap process comes out of the earth, but it has to be met by the moisture and the light processes coming from above, which means it's got to start photosynthesizing and creating its own energy. But it's coming from above, so that's a new energy. This other one's come from last season. And we know the conditions of the autumn show up in the next spring, don't they? That if we've had a really good autumn, we'll actually, even if it's dry, we'll actually have pretty good spring growth and plants will be healthy and so on. But if we have a harsh autumn, no matter what the spring's doing, the plants have still got that weakness, So this is one of his stories, is how that last season comes into this next season. And it's really carried in that wood sap phase. And as I say, it's sort of yes from here, but if it hasn't clicked in by the spring equinox, then that plant will die off if it hasn't made that top connection, you see. And so this is where the light processes become stronger, and then there's a whole bunch of trees and stuff that flower at that time. And then we sort of come along. Where are we? In spring, that's September and so on. So we haven't got berries in at that point, I don't think, at our place. The berries start to come in around here in November. So what we've got in November, around November the 5th, is that's when the warmth comes. That's the spirit part comes. And of course, this is, as I say, where we get the first fruits showing up. So our berry fruits and that sort of stuff starts ripening at that point. And then we have different processes. But this is an interesting point that we see another attack time of powdery mildew. And again, it's like here comes the warmth body of the earth. And so how is the plant relating to that? And if that connection isn't made, you know, the cosmic silica process coming out of the earth meeting this cosmic substance process coming out of the present season, if that connection isn't made, then we get powdery mildew taking place, you see. So the question is, how do we get that? How do we make that? How do we make sure that connection takes place is the question. And so, you know, we can talk about the preparations that might happen there. And then we come through to this period in February, and this is where the Earth's etheric is now going below the horizon. And so, as I say, this is another point of powdery mildew in grapes in particular. And so the question is how much that plant is now left on its own etheric. And for me, the question comes, if we want to solve this problem here, what do we have to do at this point here to strengthen that etheric activity in the plant? You know, if we're suffering from a weak internal etheric at this point, what do we do here? What can we do here to actually boost that up and keep that active longer? And again, the question being, okay, if we're suffering from a weak etheric because the earth has gone, the earth's etheric is weakened, what can we do here to strengthen the internal etheric of the plant? You know, what's the remedy for powdery mildew? And so that what we're wanting to do, see, we want to get rid of the etheric by this stage because this is when things are starting to ripen. And so to allow that ripening to occur, we get rid of that watery process so that the light and the warmth can really start to cook your plants to ripen your fruit, you see. So you've got to be a bit careful. You know, with Roundup, how they're spraying Roundup all over wheat and all the grain crops to desiccate them. You know, part of that story starts with wheat. Used to be protein level of 7, I believe, used to be quite common. And then all of a sudden they found that if they throw a whole bunch of nitrates onto a wheat crop, just as it's wanting to ripen, then the protein level in the seed will go to 13%. Because they can't measure protein. They can only measure nitrates, and they go, oh, so many percent of those nitrates is protein. So if we pump up the nitrates, our math says you've got 13% protein, and you're going to get paid more for 13% protein. But of course it's all nitrates, it's not protein. And then of course the plants actually go back into leaf, because that's what urea does. And so the plants won't ripen. And so they then come along with Roundup and desiccate it, basically burn it off and turn the raw carbohydrates into sugars and stuff through phosphoric acid burning. And there we go. We've got ripe wheat with 13% protein. Aren't we wonderful? Yippity-doo. And so, you know, this is the problem. If we actually start increasing the etheric, we're sort of pushing the plant back into the leafing process, which can inhibit the ripening process. So there's a balance in there. You know, we've got to be careful with this. But what can we do to sort of hold that etheric a little bit longer so we don't get that powdery mildew problem, you know? And so, okay, the Earth's etheric's gone back to the northern hemisphere, and now we're left with the light, and that diminishes here in the autumn equinox, and then we have the warmth is still active. And that runs right the way through to 5th of May, through into May, and in a sense that's why we can have these Indian summers, that it just sort of hangs on. But you know, you'll see after this mid-May, the cold starts coming in again. Now, the one part of the story that I haven't sort of brought in here is that we have basically from this point here, you know, we've got the plants all growing leaves and they're all flowering. And so in this sort of early November period, we have plants starting to set seed. And this is this point of what Steiner called seed chaos. And the whole point of this is that the plant enters into this like a pupa. You know, you've got the insect where you've got the grub and it goes into the pupa phase and then it becomes the butterfly. So this pupa phase is just a white gooey mess. There's no form in there. It's just this, you know, glug. And out of that comes the butterfly. And in a sense, this is the same with plants. And he says that in this pollination period, there's a stage where the seed, the seeding process, enters into this chaos phase. But it's in that chaos that it can receive the impulse from the stars that will say, you're a rose, you need to keep being a rose, but hey, the vibe's a little bit different, so, you know, this star force is a little bit different this year to last year, and so that comes in at pollination. And that varies according to the plants, you know, through this warmth process really. And so it's hard to say it happens here because, of course, it's happening at the different plants at different times. But he really makes a point that this sort of incoming star force is what he calls a male fertilisation. And so in this story, you know, we've got the plants germinating, we've got them making their leaves, we've got them flowering, we've got them receiving warmth from outside, and that's helping in their flowering and in their fruiting. And he calls this the ideal plant. He says that this stream of activity forms the ideal plant. Now, he uses a lot of different words for this. In one lecture series, he calls it the archetypal plant. Another one, you know, the ideal plant. There's about half a dozen different words. And what I've taken from that is that this is the best that plant can be that season. You know, that according to all of the factors, this is it. This is the best that the plant can be. And he calls that actually the female stream. And he's saying that, okay, as we're coming into the autumn time here, the gnomes, I'll go back and pick up the others in a minute. The gnomes are sitting here and they start collecting all this up. They collect up the male energy that's coming through the seed, and it's collecting up this female energy that's going through the seed. And they're collecting all that at this time of the year now. And at this point of midwinter, he says this is the true fructification time. This is the true fertilising time of the plant. And he makes a big point that pollination is not the full fertilisation, as it were. That it's in this midwinter point where we have this female and male stream coming together, but it's also receiving the Earth's etheric, astral and spirit energies into it as well. And that's what makes up this wood sap. It's all of this accumulation of energy and activity from the Earth and from the last season, and this then becomes this wood sap activity that comes up in the spring. And so he's saying this is all done by the gnomes. And I was always a bit shy of the elementals story, you know, until I realised in his story it's the elemental beings that join all of these other forces that we're talking about together. And so the male stream that's coming through the seed is sort of part of the cosmic force stream that's being sucked into the soil and accumulated in the centre of the earth. and the earthly substance process that's coming with this female stream, it's the gnomes that are joining it together. That's their job. It's not that they are just sitting around doing nothing. They're actually helping to make these cosmic forces and earthly substance work together. And so in this story, as we come back up here, you know, when we're talking about the Earth's etheric coming above the horizon, this is the undine beings that are active in that process of bringing that etheric to the plants. And then as we come into this astral coming above the horizon, this is the sylphs, these light beings that are helping. And he's talking about how the undines and the sylphs have to work together to bring the etheric and astral activities for this growing plant. And as I say, it's around this time that the wood sap stops, and we're now using this season's forces. We're not using the last forces. And so this is the undines and the sylphs. And in this picture here, where we said yesterday, this has to be spinning to a certain intensity to bring in the warmth. So this is then the salamanders that are bringing in this warmth process and binding that into the plant. And so he talks about how in this fructification, the salamanders bring that male seed process down into the earth and work with the gnomes to sort of wrap that into the process that then becomes this new wood sap. So that's the basic story that he's telling in this cycle of the seasons. And as I say, the question for me is, how do we use this? Because once you see it, you'll see, you know, this is a force of nature. You know, we do have this etheric coming and going and the astral coming and going, and it's like, how do we fit into that? How do we use that force that's available to nature? And how are we seeing our problems with regards to this? You know, and it's not just powdery mildew. You know, this is in the springtime here. This is the first, in our place, aphids. It's, you know, like in that spring growth, you get all these aphids coming into this game, you know, because this watery process is too strong. So what do we do to be able to, you know, in a sense, push that too strong sap? Again, it comes back to 501, actually. That's the remedy we use for aphids, is 501. Because where you've got too much, you know, from a regen ag or whatever, you're talking about nitrates, just too strong a raw nitrates in the sap, and the insects will attack that. But if you can turn those nitrates into amino acids, then it's actually toxic to the insects, and so you won't get the insects. It's all about this raw nitrate, really. And that's what 501 does. It helps to digest and metabolize nitrates into proteins so that you're not having that problem. So, you know, this is where I'm using these rhythms as the sort of basic reference for how do we solve the problems that we get at that time. So we're looking at the problem as an expression of the Earth's etheric body's movement. You know, it's not even nitrates. It's just here comes all this etheric force, all this spring growth, but it's all so soft that we're getting problems. And, you know, you get all sorts of rots and things like that happening at these times too. And as I say, we're really hot. We use also, in this period down through here, after the spring equinox, we suggest to our dairy farming clients that they use 501 at that time, and that hardens up all that sort of late autumn growth, and it helps the quality of the growth through the middle of the winter. And then we use it again in the early spring to sort of harden up that early spring growth. And we've had clients who, I've got another product called Photomax, which I guess has got outer planets in it. So 501 is a really harsh product. You know, it forces plants, changes their structure, the leaves get pointier, they stand up more, they go off to seed. You know, the morphological changes are pretty dramatic. Whereas I find the outer planet preparations, stinging nettle, dandelion, valerian, are softer. They sort of do something similar, but they're softer and don't sort of push the plants around quite so much.
Would it be a thing to say that the 501 increases the light intensity?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, that's what you're doing, but it's like, woof, you know, it's really sort of a punch.
Yeah.
Whereas the outer planets are more cajoling, you know, are more just sort of moving towards something. Whereas the 501 just sort of
increases the light intensity.
most definitely. And the whole silica processing in the plant. So, you know. But as I say, you can't keep using it. You know, you can use it, you know, once, maybe, you know, 3 times in a season or so. But, you know, I had a guy in Chile, a grape grower, and he'd been working with me for a few years, and he sort of went, I'm going to use 501 every week. Well, he grew about that much vine, but that year he won the best Cabernet Sauvignon in Chile. But all his plants were only this big, and he only got a couple of tons or whatever. So, you know, it's pretty dramatic stuff.
Is it advisable to use it that much in Australia? Where
No, not at all. No, I think you've got to use it in relationship to your district and everything like this. And I know there's this thing in Australia that there was this sense that you didn't have to use 501 because...
Podolinsky?
Yeah, Podolinsky sort of had that going. And it's about when you use it. So a big part of it is, Peter Backus has made a big point about he's really hot on the time of day that you use it. And you know, if you use it in the morning, then it tends to help with leaf growth. If you use it in the late morning, it's then starting to sort of send things off to seed and this sort of thing. And he found that using 501 in the afternoon, it really stimulates a sort of phosphorus process more than a silica process, and it actually pushes stuff right into the ground. And so we've suffered a bit here with dairy farmers who do the job when they can do the job. And there's one guy was putting it on with helicopters, and he couldn't get the helicopter in the morning, so he did it in the afternoon. And next 3 to 4 months, he basically had no grass growth. You know, it was that dramatic. So, you know.
The next season he would have had it elevated?
Well, I'm not sure. He didn't work with us after that.
Glenn, just put an attendance for these, like a 5-minute break.
Yeah, that's the story. That is the basic story. And as I say, we can work into all these points when we're sort of looking at problems, which we can do later in the day. It's just another reference point. But it is, you know, once you get in there amongst all those Steiner lectures, this is a pretty important part of the story. And as I say, the more I'm bringing this into my sort of daily life, the more I see it as a reality. And the more I'm sort of starting to look at, you know, how can we use this? How can we intervene in these points to make sure just that whole vision that what's coming from the earth has to combine with what's inside the plant. You know, we have to actually make that connection, that it's internal and external that have to work together. So anyway. Yeah, another minute.
Is that, you twist that around a bit more if you're going to have a really dry time?
I don't think so.
That's the actual earth energy coming.
Yes.
No matter whether it's dry or wet.
Yes.
Because we have virtually that chunk of from now till December, January is dry as.
Yeah.
So we don't get that flush of green growth where you're
No.
talking about it.
No. But that's why I'd be interested to see how this shows up here.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like if I gave this story to Europe, they'd all go, yes, no trouble, this is what we're seeing. But once you come into the tropics, I get it, that it's more wet, dry rather than summer, winter, you know, and so on. But at the same time, I would suspect that you will see this, regardless of wet, dry, you'll see this process because it's an earth breathing. It's the earth breathing. It's got nothing to do with where you are on the earth. It's just the earth breathing.